You ever notice how some stories don't start with a choice, but with a door you can't walk back through? That's how it was for Lydia Briggs, standing in a church that smelled like old wood polish and all the mistakes her father couldn't fix. 19 years old, wrapped in a borrowed dress 2 sizes too big, holding wilted prairie roses like they were her last bit of pride. Every bench in Rust Creek was filled. Folks weren't here to celebrate anything. They came the way crows come, when they sense something helpless on the ground. A Wild West love story wasn't what they expected today. No, this felt more like a frontier marriage drama. Everyone pretended to pity while secretly enjoying the spectacle. At the altar waited Mason Calder, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties. 34, tall, quiet, and carved by ranch life in ways money couldn't soften. People called him a millionaire cowboy behind his back, though no one dared say it to his face. Lydia kept her eyes on the floorboards, 12 between her and the door. Too far to run, too close to dream. Her father's debt hung between the stained glass windows and the church ceiling, a debt Mason cleared without blinking. On one condition, a forced marriage, Western wrapped in polite words and small-town secrets. Folks whispered Lydia had been saved. Others whispered she'd been bought. Nobody asked her what she wanted when the minister asked Mason, "Do you take this woman?" He didn't say, "I do." His voice echoed, calm as steady rain. "I will." Not a promise, not a pledge. More like a decision he'd carry on his shoulders until the end. When they stepped outside, the town swallowed them in silence. Lydia didn't hold Mason's arm. She barely breathed. Women whispered behind gloved hands. Men shook their heads. No one knew what Mason kept tucked inside his coat pocket. Some folded papers wrapped in twine. The secret wedding gift that would one day make every single whisper in this town fall dead quiet. The wagon wheels rolled over gravel as Mason drove them toward Calder Ranch. Lydia sat stiff, hands in her lap, feeling the weight of a cowboy and bride story she never wanted to be part of. Mason didn't crowd her, didn't speak, didn't pretend. Rancher hidden truth story or not, he seemed set on keeping a fair distance. Rust Creek faded behind them, the wind picked up. Lydia stared at her trembling fingers and wondered what kind of life waited at the end of that long dirt road. Whatever it wasn't hers anymore, a house too big for a stranger. Calder Ranch rose from the plains like it had its own heartbeat, huge, quiet, and far too grand for someone like Lydia. 2 stories, wrap-around porch, smoke curling from a tall chimney, a place built by calloused hands, long days, and the kind of Wild West true stories folks bragged about but never lived through themselves. Mason helped her down from the wagon without touching her more than needed. His hands were rough, steady, respectful. He nodded toward the house. "You'll be safe here." The words sounded like an oath he wasn't sure he had the right to make. Inside, the air smelled like coffee beans and warm bread. Nothing fancy, just honest ranch life romance. The living room had a stone fireplace, worn quilts, and shelves filled with books and ledgers. Lydia expected coldness. Instead, she found too much warmth, the kind that made her chest ache with confusion. Mason led her upstairs, stopped at a door, opened it. "This is your room." A bed with a blue quilt, a window looking east, a wash basin, and on the inside of the door, a lock for you, he said. "Use it whenever you want." She stared at him, then the lock. "You're giving me privacy?" "I'm giving you space," he answered. When he left, she shut the door and locked it instantly, heart pounding. She sat on the bed, clutching the quilt, wondering why a man who supposedly bought himself a bride would give her the one thing everyone else had taken, choice. That night, she didn't come down for supper, didn't speak, didn't move from her room except to breathe. But in the morning, something waited outside her door, a plate of warm biscuits wrapped in a clean cloth. She hadn't heard Mason come up the stairs. He didn't knock, just left them there, quiet as snowfall. Downstairs, Lydia heard a man's voice, older, rough, but gentle. Silas Boone, the ranch foreman. "Nasty talk in town," Silas muttered. "Folks act like you bought her off an auction block." A chair scraped the floor. Mason spoke, voice low but sharp. "She's not a bargain, she's my wife." Lydia froze in the hallway, breath stuck somewhere between fear and something she couldn't name, yet Silas sighed. "Town'll keep talking." "Let them," Mason replied. "They don't know the truth." Lydia touched the biscuit on her plate. Warmth seeped through her fingers. She wasn't sure why her chest tightened, but it did. For the first time since the wedding, something inside her cracked. Not in pain, but in possibility. The first threat days passed like cautious footsteps. Lydia moved through the house quietly, trying to learn the rhythm of ranch work. Mason woke before dawn, spent long hours mending fences, checking cattle, and riding the outer property lines. Lydia kept her distance, staying near the kitchen and trying to help where she could. One morning she stepped outside to find Mason saddling a chestnut mare. "This is Maple," he said, "gentle as they come. Thought you might want to learn to ride." She almost said no, almost ran back inside. But something about the way he held the reins, patient, never forceful, made her nod. "All right." Learning to ride wasn't easy, but Maple was calm, warm-sided, and understanding in ways people weren't. Mason guided Lydia's hands, careful not to crowd her. For the first time in days, Lydia felt her body relax as the mare walked slow circles through the yard, but peace never lasts long in a frontier life drama. They were halfway down the trail when a rider cut across their path. Warren Pike, tall, bitter, and carrying a grudge older than half the county. He glared at Mason, then let his gaze slide over Lydia in a way that made her skin crawl. "Well now," Warren drawled, "didn't think you'd bring your new bride out so soon. Folks are still buzzing about that wedding. Forced marriage story sure travels fast." Mason didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ride on," he said. Warren spat in the dirt. "Funny thing, Mason. People say you paid good money for her. Others say you're trying to cover something. Maybe this whole cowboy and bride story ain't what it looks like." Lydia stiffened. Mason rode his horse between her and Warren. Quiet, steady, unwavering. "You don't get to talk about her," Mason told him. "Not today. Not ever." Warren's eyes narrowed. "This ain't over." He galloped off, dust swirling behind him. Lydia's voice trembled. "Why does he hate you?" Mason hesitated. "History." A pause. "The kind you keep buried." She could feel the truth scratching at the edge of that answer. Something in Mason's past Warren would love to use as small-town whispers. They rode home in silence, but Lydia saw something new in Mason that day. Not just strength, not just control, protection, and not protection out of ownership, but out of something she didn't know how to name yet. Warren's threat lingered in the air, setting the stage for a cowboy sacrifice story no one was ready for. Ghosts on the porch. Some nights don't feel like nights at all. They feel like a weight on your chest that won't let you sleep. That's what pulled Lydia out of bed near midnight. The house was too quiet, too still, like even the walls were holding their breath. She crept downstairs and saw the front door cracked open. Cold wind slipped in, carrying the smell of winter grass. Mason sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, a faded photograph between his fingers. The moonlight softened everything except the sorrow in his eyes. Lydia almost stepped back inside, but something held her there. "Can't sleep?" she whispered. He didn't startle, didn't hide the photograph, just nodded toward the empty space beside him. She sat, slowly, leaving enough inches between them to breathe. The photograph was worn, creased from years of being held. A young woman with soft eyes, a baby bundled in her arms. "That's Anna," Mason said, "my wife." Lydia felt her heart drop. "Was," he nodded. "We lost her. And the baby, 5 years ago." The wind shifted. Lydia hugged her shawl tighter. "She got sick after the birth," he said, voice steady in a way that made it hurt more. "By the time I got the doctor, it was too late." Lydia didn't breathe for a moment. She'd heard rumors that Mason carried tragedy like a shadow, but she'd never imagined this. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "So am I." He rubbed his thumb along the photo's edge. "Town folks don't talk about Anna much. Maybe they think it'll rip the scab open. Truth is, some days I wish someone would say her name. Reminds me she was real." Lydia didn't expect him to say more, but he did. "Her family blames me," Mason admitted. "The Alders. They live just past the creek. They never forgave me for bringing her out here. Said the work, the land, the distance. It took her from them." "Do you blame yourself?" Lydia asked before she could stop it. A long pause. "Some days," he said. "Most days." She saw him differently after that. Not as a millionaire rancher secret to be feared, not as the man who rescued her father's land, but as someone carrying a grief deeper than anything the town whispered about. A man who wasn't trying to replace his past, only trying not to drown in it. Lydia's hand moved before her mind caught up, resting near his on the porch step. Not touching, just close enough. "I didn't know," she whispered. "You weren't supposed to," he replied. The night settled around them, not heavy this time, just honest. And for the first time, Lydia wondered if this Wild West couple story had room for something neither of them expected: healing. The women's social and the cruel question. Sundays in Rust Creek had a way of pretending everything was polite while hiding all the sharp edges underneath. Lydia learned that the moment she stepped into the church parlor, gingham tablecloths, pies lined up like soldiers, smiles stretched too tight. She didn't want to be there. She didn't want stares or whispers, but Mason had stayed home when she insisted she needed to do this alone. A frontier woman's strength moment she hoped she was ready for. Mrs. Dalton, banker's wife and self-appointed queen of Rust Creek, glided over like she owned the whole county. "Mrs. Calder," she said, sugary sweet. "Lovely that you joined us." Lydia forced a polite smile. "Thank you." For a while, the small talk felt harmless: recipes, weather, whose cousin married whose brother, the usual Old West drama women used to fill silence. Then Mrs. Dalton leaned in. "So, Lydia dear," she said, voice dripping with pretend concern, "how does it feel to be bought?" The room froze. Every teacup stopped midair. Heat flushed up Lydia's neck. "I'm sorry?" she asked quietly. "Well," Mrs. Dalton continued, "your father did trade you for his land, didn't he? Folks are just curious what the going rate is for a young wife these days." A few young women snickered. Then Miriam Pike, Warren Pike's sister, added, "Some folks say Lydia trapped Mason. Others say she saw a rich rancher love story and jumped at the chance." Lydia stood. Her chair scraped the floor, loud enough to slice the room in half. "My father was desperate," she said, voice trembling but steady. "He had no options left. If Mason hadn't stepped in, we would have lost everything. And before any of you judge me, ask yourselves, what would you have done to save your family?" Silence. "You're not concerned," Lydia continued. "You're cruel. There's a difference." She walked out without crying, without shaking, without breaking. But once she stepped outside into the cold air, her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Rust Creek wasn't just unkind. It was hungry for weakness. And that moment lit something inside Mason Calder she had never seen. When she got home, Mason waited on the porch, his jaw tight, his eyes colder than winter creek water. "What happened?" he asked. She told him everything. He didn't interrupt, didn't look away. When she finished, his voice was low and firm. "They won't speak to you like that again." "You can't control what they say," she whispered. "No," he agreed, "but I can make sure they hear me louder." That night, something shifted, not just in the town, but in Mason. He wasn't just protecting her, he was taking a stand. The letter she almost left that night, Lydia couldn't sleep. The women's words replayed in her head, louder than the church bell at dawn. She felt like she didn't belong in Mason's home, didn't belong in Rust Creek, didn't belong anywhere. So she packed a small bag. She folded a note, wrote slowly, carefully, "Mason, I'm leaving so they won't turn on you because of me. Thank you for your kindness. I won't forget it." She left it on the kitchen table and stood there in the dark, heart pounding. Every part of her wanted to stay, and every part of her feared staying would break him more. She didn't hear the footsteps. "You going somewhere?" Mason stood in the doorway, hair a mess. Holding her note, Lydia froze. He stepped closer, but not too close. "Why?" She swallowed. "I can't be the reason they tear you apart. I didn't choose this marriage. You didn't choose me. I don't belong here." He set the note down. "I chose to protect you." "That's not the same as choosing me." Silence stretched between them, raw, honest. "Why did you marry me?" Lydia whispered. "Not the debt, not the house. Why me?" Mason exhaled slowly. "Because I was tired of an empty home. And when I saw you standing there in that church, scared and alone, I thought maybe we could stop being lonely, not because of a paper, but because we both deserved a second chance." Her chest tightened. "Why do you want to leave?" he asked softly. "Because I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid I'll ruin your life." Mason shook his head. "Lydia, you're not a burden." Before she could answer, someone knocked at the back door. Lydia jumped. Mason opened it to find May Hawkins, owner of the general store. She carried a basket, bread, jam, and a knit shawl. "Figured Lydia could use this," May said. Her eyes softened. "Don't let Rust Creek break you, honey. That town hates anything it can't control." When she left, Lydia stared at the basket. Someone believed in her. Someone thought she belonged. Mason spoke quietly. "Lydia, I won't stop you from going, but I want you to stay because you want to, not because you're trapped." Tears blurred her vision. "What if I want both?" she whispered. "Then choose the part that brings peace instead of fear." She looked at the door she almost walked through, then at the man who had never once forced her hand. For the first time, she didn't feel owned. She felt seen. The secret wedding gift. Lydia didn't leave. She folded her clothes back into the dresser, set her bag aside, and breathed for the first time in weeks. Something inside her whispered that staying wasn't a cage anymore. It felt like a step toward a life she had never imagined. The next morning, Mason told her, "I have something to take care of in town." She nodded, unsure if she should ask questions. He saddled his horse and rode toward Rust Creek without explaining much. That day, he stopped at the land office, the courthouse, and finally the bank folks whispered. Rumors ran wild. A Western emotional tale like this one fed the whole town's appetite for drama. May Hawkins pulled Lydia aside when she visited the store later. "Your husband's stirring dust in this town," May said, "the kind that makes people nervous." Lydia tried to smile. "He hasn't told me anything." "That man's heart is quieter than snowfall," May replied, "but when it moves big." By the week's end, Rust Creek buzzed like a hornet's nest. Calder's up to something. He's hiding bad news. He's correcting a mistake. Some claimed Mason planned to annul the marriage. Others claimed he was drawing up a contract to secure his assets. And some, like Warren Pike, claimed Mason was setting Lydia up for humiliation. Lydia lay awake wondering if she'd made the wrong choice staying. She wanted to trust Mason. She did trust him. But fear whispered that maybe she was the fool Rust Creek believed her to be. One night after supper, Lydia finally asked, "Are people right? Are you planning something that'll hurt me?" Mason stilled, set his cup down. "No, Lydia, I'm planning something to free you." She blinked. "Free me?" He looked her in the eyes, steady, warm, honest. "I told you I wanted you to stay because you choose me. Sunday morning, you'll understand." Her stomach flipped. "What happens Sunday?" He hesitated, then smiled slightly. "You'll see." That night, Lydia lay awake listening to the ranch settle. Crickets, the distant murmur of cattle, and her own heartbeat, steady but unsure. She wanted to believe Mason, wanted to think this millionaire cowboy romance wasn't about ownership or obligation, that maybe, just maybe, it was about something real. But she didn't know yet that the papers Mason carried in his coat pocket would silence every cruel mouth in Rust Creek and change her life forever. The Sunday reckoning. Sunday morning came crisp and bright, the kind of morning that made the whole Texas Plains settlement look like it was holding its breath. The church filled fast. Folks arrived early, elbowing for better seats. Rust Creek loved drama, and this was shaping up to be the biggest Western cinematic story the town had seen since the railroad passed through. Lydia sat in the first pew, hands folded tightly. She could feel eyes on her, judgment, curiosity, a strange mix of pity and fascination. Mason sat beside her, calm as Stone Warren Pike sneered from the right aisle. Miriam Pike whispered to her friend, and near the back sat Thomas Alder, Anna's brother, still nursing old wounds and ready to see Mason fall. The minister started the service. Hymns, scripture, routine. The usual small-town secret story hiding behind polite smiles. Then, just before the sermon, Mason stood. "Pastor," he said, "I'd like a moment." A hush fell. People leaned forward like they were waiting for a gunshot. Mason walked to the front, pulled a folded document from his coat, those same papers wrapped in twine Lydia had seen the day of the wedding. "I've heard the whispers," Mason began. "I've heard folks say I bought myself a wife, that Lydia was a bargain, that she had no say." A ripple of discomfort passed through the crowd. "You're wrong." He opened the document. "What I bought was her father's debt. What I gave Lydia was safety. But what I've done now is give her freedom." He held up the paper. "This is the deed to 200 acres of prime ranch land, water rights included as of yesterday. It is legally and fully in Lydia Briggs Calder's name. Hers alone." Gasps, murmurs. A woman dropped her hymnal. Someone swore under their breath. "She can sell it," Mason continued. "She can build on it. She can walk away from it, and me, anytime she wants. No conditions, no expectations, no chains." He turned to the crowd. "She is not my property. She is my partner." The church went silent. Then Lydia stood, slowly, carefully, every heartbeat a drum in her ears. "I came into this marriage with nothing," she said softly, "and I was judged for that. But Mason gave me something I never had. Dignity, choice, safety." She turned slightly toward him. "And I choose him, not because I have to, but because he's the first person who saw me as more than a price." Mrs. Porter, the oldest woman in town, rose shakily. "I was wrong," she said, voice strong despite her age, "and I'm sorry." Others followed, apologies, nods, a shift in the air. Rust Creek wasn't kind, but even cruel towns fall quiet when truth speaks loud enough. Mason stepped beside Lydia, took her hand, and together they walked out of that church like the storm had finally passed. And for the first time, Rust Creek watched them with something other than judgment, respect. The woman the town didn't expect. Word travels fast in small places. By Monday morning, Rust Creek buzzed with talk about Lydia Briggs Calder, The young bride everyone counted out who ended up owning land more valuable than half the county men at the saloon argued about Mason's decision. Women at the mercantile whispered about Lydia's speech. Everyone had an opinion, but one thing was certain. Lydia wasn't the frightened girl who entered town weeks ago. She walked into May Hawkins' general store, shoulders squared, chin lifted. Women who once turned their backs now nodded politely. Some offered awkward apologies, even a few smiles. May placed a jar of preserves on the counter. "Look at you," she said, "walking in here like you own Rust Creek." "I don't," Lydia said with a small smile. "Just own a bit more than I expected." Outside, Warren Pike glared at her from across the street, eyes cold with something sharper than hate, envy. That ranch land deed Mason gave her? It included the creek Warren had wanted for years, the best water source in the region. A small-town whisper situation turned into a frontier dignity-restored moment Lydia never asked for, yet now carried with surprising strength. Later that week, Lydia and Mason attended church again, not because they needed to prove anything, but because hiding was no longer part of her story. People approached them. Some thanked Mason, some apologized to Lydia, some simply nodded, humbled. But the moment that stayed with Lydia was Mrs. Porter, taking her hands gently. "You're stronger than you think," she said, "and kinder than this town deserves." When they stepped outside, Mason offered his hand. Lydia took it, not because she felt she owed him, because she wanted to. Walking side by side, they passed Warren Pike. He shoved away from the post he leaned on, spit in the dirt, and stalked off without a word, a storm brewing behind his eyes. Mason watched him go. "That man's trouble," he muttered. Lydia squeezed his hand. "We've faced worse." That evening, as sunlight faded from gold to rose, Lydia stood on her porch, looking out at the horizon. She wasn't the girl who trembled through a wedding she never wanted. She wasn't the girl who almost ran away. She was someone Rust Creek didn't expect, someone she didn't expect. When Mason stepped beside her, she leaned into him without fear, without hesitation. "We'll be all right," she said. "We will," he replied. And in that moment, Lydia realized Rust Creek hadn't just changed her. She had changed Rust Creek. Spring and the fence line. Spring arrived early that year, as if the earth itself wanted to offer a fresh start. Snow melted into soft mud. Wind carried the smell of new grass. The prairie stretched wide and bright beneath a sky finally free of winter storms. Lydia spent her mornings planting bulbs, kneeling in her new land, her own land. Tulips, daffodils, apple saplings that wouldn't bear fruit for years. She planted them anyway. Hope doesn't always need proof. One afternoon, Mason walked out to join her. He leaned on a fence post, watching her pat soil around a sapling. "That one won't grow tall for a long while," he said. She looked up, smiling gently. "Good thing I'm not going anywhere." He stepped closer. "You like this land?" "It feels like a chance," she said. "Like the kind of future I wouldn't have believed in a month ago." But futures always carry hidden edges. The creek running through Lydia's new land wasn't just any water source. It was the same one Warren Pike had wanted for years. The best for cattle, the most reliable for drought years. And now it was hers. Not his, not the town's, just hers. A final twist Rust Creek wasn't ready for. Warren's anger simmered beneath the surface, and everyone knew it, whispered about it, watched him like he was a spark in dry brush. But that wasn't Lydia's burden anymore. She wasn't the scared girl they talked down to. She was the woman with 200 acres, a steady husband, and a spine of iron they never saw coming. As the sun lowered, she and Mason walked her land. Wildflowers brushed against their boots. The fence between her property and his cast long shadows across the grass. "Want me to take it down?" Mason asked gently. Lydia touched one of the fence rails. The wood felt warm from the sun. "No," she said softly. "Leave it." Mason frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because it reminds me I crossed it by choice," she replied. "Not obligation." Something in his expression softened. "I'm proud of you." She brushed soil from her hands. "I'm proud of us." They walked back toward the house. His house, her land, their future. When they stepped onto the porch, Mason opened the door, warm lamplight spilling out across the boards. "Ready?" he asked. Lydia glanced back at her land, at the apple trees waiting for spring, at the horizon wide and promising. "Yes," she said, "I am." Inside, the fire crackled, coffee brewed, and laughter, soft, honest laughter, finally filled the spaces where silence once lived. Rust Creek had tried to break her instead. Lydia Briggs Calder became the story that silenced the town forever. Because love built on freedom, not fear, will always outgrow the whispers, always.